Let's talk about materials that you're going to need for this class. You are going to need, at the barest minimum, something to draw with and something to draw in. Basically a drawing implement and a drawing pad. You can get by with just that, in fact. However, it's going to require a little bit more if you want to have better results. However, there is a limit to the benefits you can receive just by spending more on materials. In fact, you don't need to spend a lot. If you've gone to an art store recently, you'll know that there are levels of art materials available. There's something often called student level, and then there's something called artist level. And what's the difference other than the fact that one's twice the price of the other? Well, often what is the difference is that there's usually a higher concentration of pigment, for example, if it's paint, and that is why those things tend to be a little bit more expensive. However, that doesn't mean that the student level quality isn't good enough. In fact, it's more than good enough. What we really want to get past is this idea that materials or technique alone determine the quality of an illustration. It really does come down to our ability to think and plan our illustration. And so as a result, I'm going to suggest that you use, if you so choose, the barest minimums of materials. The college will provide the pens and the tracing paper and the multimedia drawing pads. However, it won't provide the paint or the brushes or the sketchbooks. The reason being is that they are relatively inexpensive if you get them in their student quality variety. However, if you want to spend a little bit more, you can, and you may reap the benefits of that. Here are the things that I recommend for this class.
I mentioned earlier that materials can really be just broken down into two categories, something to draw with and something to draw on. Let's talk about something to draw with first. Here is my drawing box. I've had this for almost 25 years. It's where I keep all my major drawing supplies. This is the one that I travel with, so as a result, this one gets used more. First and most importantly is something to draw with. This is a Prismacolor color erase pencil. These are the pencils that classical animators used in the old days when we used to draw everything by hand. These are ideal for drawing. I highly recommend these. The next most plentiful thing you see in my drawing box are these Micron felt nib pens. These are a classic. I like having these around because they're perfect for quick sketches and for executing black and white work, which we'll talk about in just a moment. I've got a lot of these. Now here is your classic Pilot fine liner. This is something that you can get from the college. I have a few other markers in here that are quite interesting. This one has a calligraphic tip, for example, and can do some very interesting marks. But I also have some charcoal pencils. As you can see, they come in various hardness levels. This one's soft, meaning that it would make a very dark mark. I like to have this one in combination with something that gives me a lighter mark. For example, this charcoal pencil is a medium. Don't know if you can see that. In combination, these two can give you some really interesting results. Let me show you an example of how I like to work with charcoal. This is an illustration. This was created on some soft watercolor paper using just charcoal pencils. The last most important bit of drawing material that I think you should have is a piece of terracotta chalk. If you go to the art store, they might call it life drawing chalk, but what you want is something that has a warm terracotta color or even orange or even red. This is what we are going to be using to transfer our drawings to our work surfaces. I talk about that process in a different video as well. So that is what to draw with. Let's talk about what to draw in. At the barest minimum, we need to have a sketchbook. Here are a couple of my latest. I tend to fill these up fairly quickly. You can see here I've got a date for the time that I used this one. And as you can see here, this is not structured drawing. This is open it up and, as they say, God only knows what's going to come out. Now, this type of drawing is just to keep myself and my wrist limber. This is the main reason to have a sketchbook. It's where I also keep notes for upcoming projects. But mostly, this is just a receptacle, the random firings that go on between the brain and the wrist. This is my latest. You can see I really like to work with the gridded paper. I'm not sure why. I love the fact that it allows me to be both very precise and loose if I want to be. Here is a sketch from a recent illustration. There's no rhyme or reason to any of this. It's all quite random sometimes, and sometimes it comes out just perfectly. But once you've got a good sketch, what do you do then? This is where you're going to need some other materials. Here is something that's going to be essential for working as an illustrator: tracing paper. Once you have a rough sketch, you need to refine that sketch to something that's going to be a working drawing. And this is how you do it, on tracing paper. I go into some detail in a previous video about how to transfer a drawing to a work surface. Speaking of which, let's talk briefly about work surfaces. At the barest minimum, you can get by with this, the Canson Mixed Media Art Paper. If I open that up and feel that, I can feel that it's got some weight to it. You can see that there is a weight right down here that says 98 pounds. That's not lightweight paper. It's not heavyweight paper either. It's enough though for you to be able to work with it using some water-based media. And again, I'm going to talk about that process in a separate video. The nice thing about this is that there is a bit of what's called tooth to the paper, a bit of roughness, which allows for you to work over top of whatever wet media you might put down with some dry media. This is the technique that we will be talking about in a later video. These materials, the tracing paper and the mixed media artboard, are available to you through the college. However, there is an option for paper and artboard that is a level up that does give you some advantages. Let me show you what those are. Here is a working mixed media artboard block from Canson. I love these artboard blocks. It's what we used to call illustration board, really. If I open that up, you can see that there is a pre-cut bit of artboard, and you can see it's got a little bit of dimension to it. You can see here is how I like to work with it, by taping off a section and then working with some wet media and then finishing that off with some dry media. Again, this is a process that we'll talk about in a later video. This is a worthwhile investment. An artboard block about this size was about $25 to $30, but I suppose you could get it cheaper if you shared that expense with somebody else. Now let's talk about some paint. At the barest minimum, I suggest you get a set of watercolors. This set here I purchased for a remarkably inexpensive price. The quality is good, but you don't need to spend much on a watercolor set. You can get an inexpensive student grade watercolor set, much like this, for a relatively inexpensive price. Now, the advantage of working with watercolors is that it allows you to layer your colors transparently over top of each other, achieving a rich color. Again, we'll talk about using this material a little bit later on. But you can have other types of paints as well. Acrylic paint, as you can see from this very old, used paint tube, works differently than watercolor. Watercolor, as the name says, is water soluble, meaning that if water comes into contact with that paint at any time, it will become liquid paint. Acrylic, on the other hand, is plastic. It goes down soft like paint, but when it dries, it's done. But there is actually a nice third option that is also something that you may consider. This is a tube of gouache. Gouache behaves kind of like watercolor in that it is water soluble at all times, but it also behaves like acrylic in that you can cover what's underneath it. These are the three paints that I will be using in my demo. At the barest minimum, I suggest you go out and get a cheap watercolor set. Let's talk briefly about brushes. What kind of brush do you need Well, what kind of brush do you need? Well, that all depends on what kind of project you're working on. Here is a typical brush that you might use for painting in oils or acrylics. It's fairly large, so you would probably use that on a fairly large canvas. Of course, if you're working on something a little bit smaller, you may want to choose something that has a little bit more precision to it. I like these little chisel brushes, and it's much smaller than that one. If you've gone to an art store recently, you'll probably have noticed that brushes are now sold by the pound. Rather than buying them individually like this, I always recommend people just buy them like that. These brushes come in these variety packs, which allows for some very diverse brush types. Here, for example, is what's called a hake, basically a long bristled soft brush, perfect for laying down large background washes of color. Amidst all of these are flathead brushes, simple small round brushes. This will get you by for most painting. However, I always recommend that you get at least 1 or 2 nice watercolor brushes. Why? Watercolor is its own special medium, and it will work much better if you are working with an actual watercolor brush. Here is a sable light watercolor brush. This is not particularly expensive, but it is probably worth as much as this, which I probably bought in a bag. This was probably about $15. If you are interested in doing watercolor, it is worth choosing one of these. Otherwise, these will serve almost all our needs. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about pallets. You've probably all seen something like that. As you can tell, I never use it. I don't recommend that you use one of these unless you feel like cleaning it on a regular basis. Otherwise, this becomes a bit of a pain. If you're going to be doing acrylics or oils, rather than using something like this, I recommend you get something like this, palette paper. Palette paper is just a wax paper put into a block, and as you use it, you just tear it off, leaving a fresh one underneath. If you're going to be doing water-based media like watercolor or gouache or even acrylic, then I recommend getting a simple palette. I have many, and I use them in various applications. This one, for example, I keep just for my pen and ink washes. However, if you're going to be doing a lot of watercolor, you may want to invest in something a little bit larger. This is my watercolor pan, and as you can see, I keep all of my watercolors out, squeezed into their little sections. Watercolor is water soluble, so even when it dries out like this, just by adding a little bit of water brings it back to life. And you can see here I have a warm side and a cool side for my color mixing. I just want to make a quick note about pencil crayons. Here is my set of Prismacolors. I've had these for years. Prismacolor pencil crayons are considered the best in the industry. Their leads are particularly soft, perfect for layering. They'll go down well on almost any surface, but they also layer particularly well, lending themselves very well to the technique that I call glazing. This is the technique that we will be exploring later on. Now, Prismacolors are, unfortunately, on the expensive side, but you don't need to get Prismacolors in order to get good results using pencil crayons. The thing to remember is that you'll always want to keep your pencils as sharp as possible, so you may want to invest in a good pencil sharpener.